If not, it's on the resource list, right?
Oh, yeah. All right, so we left off kind of halfway through this video yesterday.
Kevin,
So, yeah.
did we watch it?
You want to watch it too?
Yeah.
I thought it would sound awful quiet in here. We'll just edit this part out.
Like I'm just gonna stand if they describe
Well, I got to find where we
it.
left
So a
off.
lot of them. You're like, oh really?
The beginning of the diaphragm.
Oh, I totally understand what you're saying.
About what?
We were like, we should have just
Let
said
it
nothing
go.
and let you play the video. Just solemnly agree with you.
uses about 10 visual.
Oh, yeah, we stopped right about there.
Maybe less.
Yes, we did.
Talked about
That's a
that
volume
little
of
tiny
fuel.
bit of stuff. All right, so now I got to. Dang it. All right, there we go.
About equal to this cube. At idle, the volume of fuel per stroke may be less than that of a grain of salt. This red line represents performance for an overhauled pump, and this blue one for a new one. Their performance is essentially the same. The difference is just the normal production variation
This is irrelevant, so if you didn't get that, don't worry about it.
between individual pumps. At zero flow, this overhauled pump reached 27 psi max.
We just barely started. They told me to stall. Okay, so again, on this particular pump, max pressure is at what kind of flow? None, because it's a spring-driven pump. And so, yeah, it's showing that.
With flow at 5 gallons, the pressure drops to about 25 psi. And at 10 gallons, to below 25 psi. The pressure will keep falling as flow increases. Maximum pressure is checked at zero flow in 1800 cycles. If the maximum pressure at zero flow is from 24 to 30 psi, the spring is good and internal leakage is satisfactory. One flow check occurs at 2 psi in 1800 cycles. 45 gallons an hour is the acceptable minimum flow at these settings. As back pressure increases, flow decreases. Here's the result of applying back pressure at 5, 10, and 15 psi. This pump's flow dropped by about 2, 16, and 30 gallons, respectively. It's the servo, not the pump, that establishes pump pressure.
What establishes pump pressure for this pump? The servo, because it has restrictions. If you don't have restrictions, you have no pressure.
Can you talk about when he was mentioning the 5, 10, and 15?
It's not important.
Okay.
It was just, it goes on a little bit too much about checking the pump, about the different flows at the different pressure rates, but that's not important.
Okay.
Pressure, also called servo inlet pressure or unmetered pressure, on an engine using about 28 gallons an hour might typically be about 20 to 23 psi. The servo's regulator reduces the pump pressure to metered pressure. That's the pressure that goes to the cylinder nozzles and determines the correct fuel-air ratio for the engine. Metered pressure is normally well below unmetered or pump pressure. As long as pump pressure exceeds metered pressure, full flow is available to the nozzles.
Okay, so what he's saying there is inside of the servo or the fuel control unit, and we'll talk about this next thing here, is that the pump pumps the fuel into the fuel servo or the fuel control unit. That is pump pressure. And then the fuel control unit is going to do what it does with its orifices and its controls, and that's going to be, so you have unmetered, then you have metered fuel pressure. So it reduces it down, and that's called metered fuel pressure. So that's what he's referring to there, that as long as the pump is producing the appropriate pressure for the unmetered fuel pressure, then the fuel control unit can do its thing. But if the pressure starts to drop too much on the inlet, then it throws everything out of whack for the fuel control unit. But that's really not a problem because this pump puts out enough.
The servo compensates for the normal variations in pump pressure and holds metered pressure relatively steady so that the engine gets the proper amount of fuel. A 200 horsepower engine using 18 gallons per hour might have a metered pressure of about 10 to 12 psi. As long as the pump pressure is higher than metered pressure, fuel flow is okay. However, if pump pressure falls below metered pressure, the servo regulator goes full open and effectively becomes a fixed orifice. Then, if pressure falls even further,
Do you understand that?
Yes.
So it's saying as long as the pump pressure is higher than what it's than the meter pressure, then the fuel control unit or servo, or what you call it by different names, is doing the metering. But as soon as the two are matched, then in a sense what the fuel control unit did is it takes out all of the orifices and says, give me all you got, because that's what I need. And then if what it needs is still not enough, then
so does nozzle pressure and fuel
everything
flow.
starts falling to hell.
Here's a representative 200 horsepower fuel curve. Unmetered pressure, that is pump pressure, was intentionally reduced from 20 psi in increments to show what happens to metered pressure and fuel delivery as pressure falls. Fuel flow, shown in percent, stayed within 3% of maximum until pump pressure fell below 10 psi.
This is another way of saying the pump puts out
Above
enough.
14 psi pressure, there was almost no discernible change. Flow remained within 2% of the original. The names 25-pound and 5-pound pump are just names for the common high and low pressure pumps normally used on fuel injected and carbureted engines, respectively. The flow capacity of the high pressure pump is sufficient to run both engines simultaneously on a Piper Aztec when cross-feeding. At high power, that's about 50 gallons per hour. This pump's pressure at 53 gallons an hour is about 18 psi. That's well above the typical metered pressure for an IO540. So it can run two of these engines simultaneously with no problem. A little IO360 engine sipping 22 gallons an hour is just no problem for a high pressure fuel
22
pump.
gallons an hour.
This pump's dual diaphragms provide
Okay, so this is, he mentioned something about the 20 and 25 pound pumps. So there's the high pressure, low pressure. There, I think they show a picture here, distinguishable by a retaining ring on the bottom. Now he's going to talk about the different diaphragms, which I promise you I will be asking you in your oral, because it's really easy oral, because there's not much to this pump. So this kind of starts that.
safety and pumping redundancy.
Okay, so it has, let me back up because I talked and kind of disrupted that. So it's got two upper diaphragms and then a lower diaphragm.
Just no problem for a high pressure fuel pump. This pump's dual diaphragms provide safety and pumping redundancy. The upper diaphragm keeps fuel out of the engine crankcase if the fuel diaphragm leaks, thus preventing oil dilution or a crankcase explosion or a fire. Fuel leaking through the lower diaphragm accumulates in the chamber between the two diaphragms as shown here. Then it leaks out the drain fitting, which is fitted with a tiny orifice, and then it goes overboard. Diaphragms as shown here.
Okay, so, oh wow. This is supposed to be air in this chamber right here. So you have an upper diaphragm and a lower diaphragm. The upper diaphragm is there in case the bottom one has a hole in it. So if you get a hole in the bottom one, rather than going into the crankcase, and as you said, causing an explosion, it is going to go into this little chamber here and continue to work. So fuel comes up, leaks into here, but it's vented overboard through a little tattletale. So it still works if the bottom diaphragm ruptures. You're now relying on the top one.
And this two diaphragm system is on the 20 and 22?
Both of them. All the aviations ones.
All of them? Okay, cool.
Here. Then it leaks out the drain fitting, which is fitted with a tiny orifice, and then it goes overboard. The leakage makes a blue streak on the aircraft's belly, alerting the pilot to the problem. Checking for this should be part of a good pre-flight inspection. If the fuel diaphragm bursts, the chamber between the diaphragms will fill solid with fuel, and the pump will keep right on pumping. The tiny orifice in the drain ring restricts external leakage and creates pressure in the chamber between the diaphragm. That allows a solid hydraulic column to form that keeps the pumps working, even with a burst fuel diaphragm. However, if the leakage from the drain ring is not piped overboard, and that gasoline is sprayed onto a hot exhaust pipe or turbocharger, it could cause big problems. Always pipe the drain ring overboard and never plug the port. Air inlet leaks are the cause of most pump performance problems, and it only takes a small one to defeat the pump. A missing or chipped O-ring, a cracked inlet boss, or an air leak at a fitting is all it takes to stop the pump working. Air, sucked into the pump's chamber, fills the pumping chamber, displaces the gasoline, and stops the fuel flow. Some air leaks may cause fuel starvation soon after the boost pump is turned off, whether on the ground or in the air. Smaller air leaks can cause a loss of pressure and fuel starvation some seconds or minutes after the boost pump is turned off. Sometimes this happens on takeoff or during the climb. Usually, turning the boost pump back on gets the fuel flowing again, but turn off the boost pump and soon the engine may quit again. After air leaks, levers broken during installation cause the most problems. This lever is under the push rod, where it's supposed to be, while this lever is improperly installed beside the push rod, not under it where it's supposed to be. When the mounting bolts are tightened, the side load imposed will break the lever. This broken and bent lever shows that it was installed beside the push rod, not under it. And this signature mark on the lever further confirms it. Another cause of problems is blocked or partially blocked fuel systems. Debris can block tank outlets, causing engine stoppage. After the engine stops and there's no fuel flowing, the debris may float away from the tank screens, temporarily clearing them. Then the engine may start again, and the cycle of startup, clogged screens, fuel starvation, and engine stoppage may be repeated. If not found and corrected, an in-flight power failure and a post-flight crash may occur.
Post-flight crash.
The pump's pulsator diaphragm helps to smooth out fuel pressure pulses. Each diaphragm downstroke creates a pressure spike that stretches the pulsator diaphragm a little, storing a little energy. That energy is released on the pump's upstroke. It smooths out the pressure spikes and helps reduce the workload on the servo regulator. Don't take these pumps apart in the field if you intend to use them again. It takes special equipment to properly reassemble them. Pumps should be overhauled or replaced at intervals specified in the aircraft manufacturer's instructions for continued airworthiness, or in the absence of such instruction, at engine TBO or after 10 calendar years, whichever comes first. These pumps contain rubber parts, and time and heat and repeated flexing takes a toll on them. Nothing can be expected to last forever, so periodic overhaul is important. That's how diaphragm pumps work. They are highly reliable, inexpensive, and simple. When installed properly, these pumps are likely to run to TBO without problems. If you have questions or need a new or overhauled pump or other Tempest part, give us a call. We appreciate your business. Thank you. Sucked into the pump's chamber, fills the pumping chamber, displaces the gasoline, and stops the fuel flow. Sauce or an air leak at a...
Okay. The fittings on these pumps are unusual. So you have this boss right there. What kind of threads do you suppose that is? You'd suppose it is. It is not, and it would make sense, and that's what I would expect, but it's not. It is actually the same size as an AN flared fitting. So if you were actually to put a pipe fitting in here, it would kind of tighten up, but the pressure would probably blow it out as soon as you started up the engine. So it's not. It's actually use a bulkhead fitting, and I think I've explained this before. A bulkhead fitting, you can turn the lights on, is a fitting that's designed to go like from one side of the firewall to the other. And the way this is actually a bulkhead fitting right here. So you'd have a nut on one side, you can put like a nut on the other side, and the firewall goes in between. So it's just a different thing. Just be aware of that. So you screw it in where you want it, clock it in the position where you want it to go, and then you put an O-ring in there and you tighten this up, and it tightens it all together. So it's actually
So there's another.
it's straight threads with an O-ring, but it looks like pipe. It is not.
So the O-ring allows it to be tightened more?
It's sealed. It's a seal.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, and the bulkhead fitting or the nut allows you to put that angle, the fitting wherever you want it. Otherwise, the problem with pipe fittings you know, at 90 degree and you're tightening it up and you want it to be tight right here, it tightens right here. That's too loose, that breaks it. So they knew that, so they put these fittings in. Yeah, we had one of our tool room guys, he was all pissed off. Oh, these damn metric pumps, nothing ever works. I'm like, well, it's a bulkhead fitting, it's straight threads. And because he spent like 3 hours trying to find a fitting. I'm like, it just goes like that. So anyway, just be aware of that. So, all right. I think we're good there. There's 3 diaphragms. Upper, middle, lower. Ooh, what is wrong with this picture? See, it's really sharp.
Those,
I never noticed it before.
the little revolver looks like they're bent. Those smaller
Nope.
holes,
These are the check valves.
check valves.
Nothing wrong with them.
One's in backwards.
What is this? Pipe fitting. Pipe plug? Plug the hole. What's the hole for?
Drain.
And that fuel coming out of there tells you what? That this diaphragm ruptured. So probably this diaphragm ruptured and some, you know, oh, well, that's because some dummy forgot to put the plug in. So they fixed it.
Supposedly fixed it.
All right.
So you said there's an upper, middle, and a lower?
Yep, I'll write this down.
Okay.
In theory. Let me see. Oops, not there. Way back here. There we go. Diaphragm fuel pump. Extremely common in general aviation. So 3, diaphragm fuel pump. Thank you. Fuel pump, extremely common. Not on Continentals. Lycomings use them. So every Lycoming that's got any sort of fuel injection system or low wing Lycoming is going to have one of these things. Classified as a variable displacement pump. It is in fact engine driven, but considered a spring operated pump. That's probably a bad way to put it. It's considered an engine driven pump, but it's actually spring operated. To understand that the spring is what is pushing down on the diaphragm. The engine just resets the spring. Put that. So the engine resets the spring. The engine only resets the spring. As needed. Components. Let's see. 1. Uses 2 check valve. Uses 2 check valves. So when the engine pushes the spring, cocks the spring, pulls the spring up, pulls the diaphragm up, fuel then comes in, is sucked up into that chamber through a check valve that only allows it to go this way, is stored now in this chamber, and when it pushes down, you have a check valve on this side that allows it to go out and not that way. So it uses 2 check valves. Obviously one flowing in and one flowing out. It has the diaphragms. We have a main diaphragm. That's the middle one. Or the center diaphragm. That one does all the work. And then we have an upper diaphragm. And that's the safety diaphragm. Safety. And so should the main diaphragm rupture or get a hole, the upper diaphragm then keeps the fuel from going into the crankcase, diluting the oil, causing an explosion, and allows the pump to keep working. And then we have the lower diaphragm. Oh, this is lower. Called the pulsator diaphragm. So the pulsator diaphragm, when the spring pushes down on the fuel to push the fuel out the check valve, it's going to go through that check valve, and on the bottom is that pulsator diaphragm, and it'll stretch that pulsator diaphragm a little bit. And then as the spring goes back up, this will push this way and kind of push fuel out. So number one, it's a shock absorber. So it takes out the pulsations of the spring coming down, and two, it gives a little energy back into it. And I'm not going to write all that down, sorry. 3, we have the heavy spring, which actually does all the work. And then we have the arm driven on a cam. Well, I should say driven on a cam and push rod or plunger. All right, so operation. As the cam and plunger press the arm down, the spring is compressed and diaphragm is lifted up. So as cam and plunger press arm down, press the arm down, the spring is compressed. And diaphragm is lifted up. Wish I didn't have to keep spelling diaphragm. Just put D. All right, this draws in fuel. So this draws in fuel through the inlet check valve. Through the inlet check valve. If there is a demand, for fuel, the spring presses down on the diaphragm. Well, actually, the spring's going to press down the diaphragm no matter what, if there's need or no need. So, kind of a bad sentence. But I should say, the spring presses down on the diaphragm, and if there is a need for fuel, that would make much better. The spring presses on the diaphragm, pushing fuel out the outlet check valve. So the pump itself has got 3 fittings on it. What are those 3 fittings? Inlet, outlet, overflow, or safety valve, or drain.
Okay.
How do you know which one's inlet, which one's outlet?
Depends on the way
Yeah, it depends on the way the pump runs, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. The arm only goes up and
Up
down.
Wait, what? You lost me.
The arm only goes up and down.
So that was a trick question.
That was a trick question. Actually, it was a trick answer because you're the one that said depends on which way the pump runs.
Yeah.
I asked which one's inlet and outlet. That is a legitimate question. Which one, and how do you know which one's in and which one's out?
Oh.
Put your finger on one side and
You cannot press that spring down by hand. It's really, you can put it on maybe a table and do it. It'd be really hard.
press.
Hydraulic press.
High pressure.
Probably marked, aren't they?
That too.
The inlet has the words IN and the outlet has the words OUT.
Oh man.
Really
Can you give us an example of when the engine wouldn't need fuel?
When it's off.
Yeah, when it's off. When it's off.
When the engine's on, is there
No, it always needs it.
okay.
If it's running, it needs it, even in idle.
So then it's always in an open.
Playing on.
So, yeah, you pull the idle cutoff.
Yeah.
You're in the air, you're flying. You pull idle cutoff, and then you go into a descent.
And that's the only time that the
And you would never want to do that. So, we don't turn our engines off in flight.
so the reason why it only opens when fuel is needed is so it doesn't go into the
Okay, so again, all right, I should redo the sentence. If the engine's operating, there's always a demand.
right.
If you pull it to idle cutoff and it's dying,
Mm-hmm.
the few revolutions, it doesn't need any fuel then.
And
So for that brief second. So the takeaway is the spring presses down on that chamber.
yeah.
The amount of fuel needed will leave, but only the amount that the servo called for.
Okay.
The servo called for a grain of sand leaves.
What happens if there is no need but the fuel still goes?
It doesn't go.
Okay. Because of the safety or whatever.
Nope. Because the safety diaphragm.
It's in the video.
Which part?
The one that we just watched.
Yeah. If there's no need, then
It just
the arm lifts up on the spring, and the arm drops down, which does nothing, and then spring tries to push on the fuel. Fuel goes nowhere.
The reason that is not to waste fuel or just because it's not needed. So why pump it?
It's a closed circuit, so it goes from the fuel pump directly to the fuel control unit. If the
Right.
fuel control unit is not letting fuel go to the engine, then the fuel has nowhere to go. The fuel control unit, carburetor,
Mm-hmm.
is a valve, and the valve is off. So it's like at home. You've got your municipal utility district has big pumps running to pump water to your house. How much water comes out of the faucet when you have the faucet off?
No.
Okay, so those pumps are still running, and you've got the faucet off. The faucet is the fuel control unit.
Yeah, there's no need for it.
So now just imagine it's this pump. They got a diaphragm with this giant spring on it. It's pushing down, but you're at home. Hey man, anybody seen Nick? We got this. His water pump over here has just been sitting idle for a while. Yeah, he's not even home. So you get home. Hopefully you take a shower, turn it on. Now it presses down, and they got a horse that draws it back up. I don't know. Yes.
Probably not know this, but is as far as having three separate diaphragms, is it an assumption that if there's going to be a first failure, it's going to be the main diaphragm, or are they composed of different material that?
I think the assumption is because that main diaphragm works harder than the other one. The other one's just flexing. There's no pressure on it.
Right.
So the main one would go first. And even if the bottom one goes, you guys are going to take it apart and you'll notice that it does act as a gasket, but it's still, you could have a rupture in that. It's not going to cause any problems. So the only problem you get is when that main diaphragm ruptures. So yeah, the assumption is,
Same material, one just gets exercised more than
Yeah.
the other.
otherwise they would say, well, why not just, well, we've made the main one out of crappy material and this one out of really good stuff. I'd say, well, then just make them both out of really good stuff. So that's my guess. Okay, we clear so far?
Yeah.
Okay. So
Yeah, I understand how it operates. I was just trying to figure out why it just don't allow the fuel to keep running
Where would it run to?
inside the engine.
Whoa, you're just gonna dump fuel into the engine?
Right. That's why.
What if I pulled it back to idle?
You don't need it. Right.
You can't just keep dumping fuel in there.
Right. Which
You
is
would
why they
hope
designed
It
it.
cuts off fuel.
What's that?
So you would hope that it cuts off fuel.
Yeah. Otherwise, we're talking about those old rotary engines, not the Mazda, but the other ones that only ran like at full power. So don't want that. Where am I here? 3, 4. Well, I'm not going to write this one because I'll just confuse Nick. If there's no demand, spring remains compressed, diaphragm remains up, and no fuel is pumped out. But then you'd say, well, when do we need that? Well, we don't. All right. Upper diaphragm. Upper diaphragm keeps any fuel that leaks from the main diaphragm from leaking into the crankcase. So keeps any fuel that leaks from main diaphragm from leaking into crankcase. I have heard of instances where fuel has gotten into crankcases and exploded, blows out part of the case. It's not good. It acts as a backup diaphragm. We have the CFG. We have the pulsator diaphragm. Which one is that one? Bottom. Evens out, so it evens out fuel pressure pulsations. To prevent excessive wear on the servo. To prevent excessive wear on the servo. And again, servo is going to be another word for your fuel control unit, which is not the carburetor, but now it's fuel injection systems or pressure carbs. And we have the drain fitting. Used to indicate a leaky main diaphragm. Used to indicate a leaky main diaphragm. And if that starts leaking, what do we do? Put a plug in it?
Yep.
What happens if you don't vent it overboard?
And it goes into hot exhaust or.
And then you burn people to death. So don't do that. It shoots flames.
Is the pulsator diaphragm after the outlet check valve? In between that
Yes.
and the servo?
Yes, it is. Pump basics. What do I hear? Pressure and flow are inverse. This is for this pump only. Pressure and flow are inverse. Just the design of the pump. As you start letting the flow get higher and higher, it just can't keep up the pressure, so the pressure starts dropping off. Let's see. Large opening will allow a lot of fuel to flow and the pressure to be low. Small opening will restrict flow and cause pressure to go up. Maximum pressure was at zero flow. I don't think I need to write all that. Pump does not determine how much fuel flows to the engine. Pump does not determine how much fuel flows to the engine. What does?
FCU?
Fuel control unit. Let's see. Pump must meet or exceed the servo demand, or there is a loss of proper fuel to the engine. Pump, let me see. Pump must meet or exceed, so pump must meet or exceed, hopefully exceed, the servo demand. If the servo says, I need more fuel, and the fuel pump can't deliver it, everything goes to hell. Always plumb drain lines overboard. There are high and low pressure pumps, so there are high and low pressure pumps. You put the one on that the airframe manufacturer calls for. High pressure pumps are identified by a reinforcing ring. So high pumps, high pressure. High pressure pumps have a steel reinforcing ring on the bottom. And air leaks are a serious problem. So air leaks are a serious problem. So we want to make sure all of our fittings are on properly. The O-rings are good. Tighten them up, not too tight, so where you break the housing on the pump. So these pumps are pretty easy to deal with. As a mechanic, you're just going to remove and replace them. The problem with removing and replacing them is they are not easy to install, even when you have room to install them. Because as you know, you built the light combing and you have that idler gear with the cam on it. And when that cam rotates around to the bottom and it pushes that plunger down, now that plunger is down pretty low and you have a very small window to work out of, and you have to get that plunger in at an angle. You got to pick up the plunger and push it up. So you got to make sure. So what I do is I put my finger in there, put my finger on the plunger, rotate the prop until it goes all the way up. Take your finger out and it's going to slide down because gravity. So you take your pump and you put it in and you make sure that the arm gets right in the middle, lifts it up, slide the pump in, straighten it out. You got to hold it in place while you bolt it. And then the problem is with these, they use an internal like Allen wrench. So most mechanics who work on these engines, we have a special Allen wrench at the ball end one, so you can get a little angle on it because there's not much room back there. And then you tighten it up, torque it, and safety wire it. Then we put the fittings in, which take are they pipe straight? Yeah, bulkhead fitting. People say that's not a bulkhead fitting. It is bulkhead fitting. So straight with an O-ring, clock them correctly, tighten them down, plumb the drain line overboard, and you're good to go.
What would be the difference between a high and low pressure pump?
Just what it calls for, whatever the servo. It has a reinforcing ring on the bottom.
Okay.
But when to use one versus the other?
Like what would be an example of a low pressure? Like
It just says lower pressure.
Same.
Like it's like 20 psi. I think the other one's 25 or something.
so okay, close but different.
Yeah. You
Is
just-
that steel ring like a?
big washer.
Okay.
Yeah, big washer on the bottom. Ours have. You'll see them.
Couple of issues with replacement of pumps. Would you rotate the engine, make sure that cam is on the low?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
While putting it in, you just take it out where it is because you don't know.
And then secondly, would you ever use grease on that push rod to hold it up while you're?
If the grease worked, yeah, I don't see a problem with that. Little tiny bit of grease wouldn't be a problem. But I never had a problem pushing it up, and yeah, the oil's cold and stuff. It slides pretty slow, so you just push it up, kind of get ready, and it's never been a problem. But yeah, it'd be a good thing to do. A little super glue. So,
Not as strong as the cam, right?
I know. So I was thinking, the cam is much stronger than super glue. You just glue it up in place. When the engine starts, it'll push it down. Don't do that, okay? Just-
Disclaimer.
All right. Let me see. Is there much else I can tell you about this pump? They are ubiquitous, means they are everywhere. That's why I call them that. So, yep, that's the big deal. Okay, break time, and then we're gonna have some fun.
Oh,